I'm going to introduce our speakers in a second, but I wanted to start by kind of introducing her, because today marks a curious milestone for a novel so bound up with youth and desire and beauty and the corruption of all three. Lolita is a senior citizen. Lolita is actually 5 years beyond what the age for the cutoff for a senior citizen in this country. And it's strange to think that I'm talking about the book, not as protagonist, but she is a boomer who can now collect Social Security, join the AARP, grumble about how fast the world is changing and how incomprehensible it has become. 70 years old our Lolita is, and I think it's worth our while to look back on her birth and how it was in fact anything but peaceful. Her gestation was, for one thing, very long. It was also secretive. Of its creation, Nabokov said it cost him 5 years of monstrous misgivings and diabolical labors, and I think this can only be said of something be said by someone who has not experienced labor. So I do judge our dear Vladimir on that, but I don't, as a writer, I agree that it was likely quite diabolical to metaphorically give birth. But clearly, Nabokov had been thinking about this book for much longer, even before he started writing, during his time in exile, with odd poems and short stories that always featured troublingly young girls and older men. I like to imagine myself being Edmund Wilson in 1947, on the receiving end of a letter that reads, "I'm currently writing a short novel about a man who likes little girls, and it's going to be called The Kingdom by the Sea." And then the embryo of the book grew monstrously in notebooks and index cards. And by the time he finished, that was only the beginning of another kind of labor, because he couldn't, as you know, this is a story that we all know well, he could not find a publisher the world over for a book that he referred to as one of his favorite children. And I kind of think I have many friends with school-age children, and I think it's not unlike believing like your 6-year-old is the most beautiful, brilliant, precocious child, and somehow you can't enroll her in a public school in all five boroughs of New York City. There's no one who will accept this child who you think like is just, you know, like, I mean, look at her. Like, how can you not want to snatch her up? No pun intended. But in its own way, of course, Lolita was also an illicit child, and she entered the world, the school, the publishing house, as it were, under this cloud of kind of scandal. Banned in France, denounced in Britain, published only after years of moral panic, and the irony is that it, didn't really become that much better because it was called obscene, perverse, unprintable, which finally for our dear Nabokov turned out to be both a blessing and a curse in the sense that it immediately shot up to bestseller lists and gave him enough money to finally retire for good and to be able to do the thing that he really loved, which is write. So here we are today with Lolita, and I think there is an irony here that he might have finally savored, which is that his internally adolescent heroine has, entered not young adulthood or adulthood, but has been living in middle age and now old age for a few years now, and I want to pose as the question, my first question to both my panelists about how Lolita continues to demand our attention in 2025. What is enduring, what newly urgent about it? And while I give you guys a couple minutes to think about the question, I just want to briefly introduce Sarah Weinman, friend, and author of the real of the book of the about Sarah Horner, the real girl behind Nabokov's fiction, even though kind of how closely kind of related they are is a question that I am going to throw to Sarah. And Julia here, who is a professor of theater.
Well, yeah, not currently, but I was for a long time.
And whose novel, Vladimir, is in so many ways in conversation with Lolita. And I sort of gobbled up both their books last night. I mean, that's literally like not a lie, because I asked for PDFs of both their books.
That's a record, Jiayang.
Why do you think I appear so manic? This is all just caffeine right here. I have to apologize. I mean, these are and I have to say these are two writers that are very different in style, but whose books really are worth checking out. I did not expect to be introducing the two of them, so my bios of them are, sadly very truncated. But what I do know is of their writing, which is superb, and really, who needs a resume when you can just believe what I say, which is that they're both terrific writers. So, who wants to start? I mean, is Lolita still, what makes it enduring? What makes it newly urgent? Does anyone want to take over?
Okay.
Sarah was just talking about this in the green room a little bit.
I think that, we're in this moment of continued insanity. I don't think I need to get into the details. And it actually feels like the level of cognitive dissonance that we're faced with, what people are asking us to accept as real and what they're not, is really tied in with everything that you can find out in Lolita. Because here is a novel about the repeated sexual assault of a young girl, told from the vantage point of the perpetrator, and the narrative is so propulsive and so seductive that you really just fall into this trap that he is telling the truth, when in fact Humbert is possibly the most famous unreliable narrator there ever is. And so, my own experience of reading Lolita, I read it first when I was 16, which, in hindsight, I would say that's a little young. Because on the one hand, it was a novel that when I was reading it at a time when I was reading a lot of, transgressive works. In the high school that I went to in Canada, we studied Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And I thought, well, if I could read that, let me look at some other comparable works. Ended up on like a weird Philip Roth binge, which is a story for another day. Another, Portnoy's Complaint is also a book, don't read, or it's not don't read that when you're 16, because it's going to mess you up. So then I thought, okay, Lolita. So I pick it up, I read it. And it was really the strangest thing, speaking of cognitive dissonance, of I knew that there was a lot that I wasn't getting, but I could tell that this was literature and that whatever was beyond the horizon was going to challenge me if I let it for basically forever. And then I didn't read it for about 2.5 decades. And it really wasn't until I started on yet another internet late night rabbit hole and found out the story of Sally Horner, that when she was 13, when she was 11, she had been kidnapped by a much older man named Frank LaSalle, calling himself Frank LaSalle. He used many, many names, and then was taken on this cross-country odyssey nightmare that took her from Camden, New Jersey all the way to San Jose, California. And then she was rescued when she was 13. Unfortunately, she died when she was 15 in a car accident. And that bit of news Nabokov read, and we know this because in the Library of Congress, in his archives, there was a little note card where he wrote down the AP story about Sally's death. So, and I think, Jiayang, your point about, you could argue how much of an inspiration Sally's blighted life and tragic death had on Lolita, because I think it's very clear that he had been thinking about this subject, this story, this topic for many, many years. I mean, The Enchanter, which was the short story that had a similar theme and similar plot, that came out in 1939 in Russian, though it wouldn't be translated into English for many decades. But it was there. And other works, poems, other novels had little bits that would help inform him. But it really wasn't until he read about Sally's death that I believe, and I think there's good circumstantial evidence for this, that was kind of the impetus to unlock something. And that happens a lot when you're writing fiction. You read something and suddenly, oh, I know how to solve a plot point. So that's how I view it. But at the same time, it's like Lolita just inspires a lot of misreadings and misunderstandings. And 70 years later, I still think it is one of the greatest books of greatest novels that was published in the 20th century, and probably the most misunderstood.
I mean, that relationship between fact and fiction is so interesting because, of course, your book is a work of nonfiction, and it.
You have to use the mic.
Oh. Well, I don't know. I feel like we're one big happy family here. It's you guys can hear my loud blabbing voice well enough. But I was, in preparing for this panel, I was thinking about how your work in many ways is inspired by a work of fiction. At least the impetus to do the research, and of course for you, Julia. I mean, you. Your book is in a different kind of conversation. It's a work of fiction. And I'm going to put a different spin on the question I kind of threw out broadly to the both of you. Did it still feel, in what ways did it feel, in what ways does Nabokov's Lolita, did it feel relevant to you as you were writing Vladimir?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a lot of different ways that I felt like it influenced. I mean, there's the very famous story that I think is in the afterwards where Nabokov says that he was mostly inspired not by Sally Horner's death, but by an article about an ape who was given a paintbrush, who uses the paintbrush to And when he was given the paintbrush, all he did was paint the bars of his own cage over and over and over again. And I found that as an inspiration to think about taking for myself as a fiction writer. That felt the most interesting, because I felt like what Lolita does so well is it gives a portrait of someone who's blinded by their obsession. He can no longer perceive reality because he's so incredibly blinded by his own obsession with Lolita and his own sickness. And as I was saying in the back room, one of the things we often forget about Lolita is that at the very beginning of the book, he tells us he's writing it from jail. He's a man who's in prison recollecting upon essentially his missteps, and he says he's sick. He says he tries to get treatment. He says it over and over in the beginning. And I think what's so fascinating is that the reception, especially at the time it came out, was always just, I mean, you even have these interviews of Calvin Trilling basically saying like, wow, Humbert, what a great guy. Lolita, what a little temptress, and that was the narrative that kind of went alongside the book, even though the book really doesn't support that at all, and Nabokov didn't support that at all. I was rereading his Paris Review interview, and they say something along the lines of like, even Humbert is a lovable wretch. And he says, no, Humbert is a wretch, plain and simple. He never intended the book itself to be an endorsement in any way, I think, of Humbert's viewpoint. I think instead what he wanted to explore, and what I think is so interesting, what I think is so relevant, is the way our gaze and our fixation can take over our realities, and it can change us so that we see the world through our eyes and we view things as acceptable through the lens of our limited perception and obsessions. And I think that's what the book does so fantastically well. And what I think is so interesting is like we can't, as Humbert is a writ large manifestation of the fact that we can't see past our own what has shaped us, and he starts out the book saying what has shaped him is he had basically this Annabelle Lee character, Kingdom by the Sea is a Edgar Allan Poe poem.
And he was pretty well obsessed with Poe his whole life.
Yes, and Poe himself had a very young bride.
Yes, he did.
But it's and the first lines are, I was a child and she was a child in my kingdom by the sea, and we loved with a love that was more than a love. And so he sets that out as like, this is his main issue, is that he loved this young woman. And in Annabelle Lee, she also dies. He loved this young woman at 15 years old. She died, and he's never been able to break himself from that reality. And so I think, one thing I think that's obviously so enduring too is just the sheer brute force of the male gaze inside of the book. His incessant and unrelenting, and really, when you read it, very queasy-making view of Lolita and her body, and the endless descriptions about her are, especially when you read it if you have a young daughter, as I do, like absolutely chilling in what he's able to make his fixation. But I think it's really a book about like building temples in your mind and then worshiping at them. And I think that's what Humbert does. And I think that's why the book is actually so effective. And I think Nabokov, in the way of like great tragedians, he was interested in folly. He was like, how does man fall? And I think Lolita is really a study of how this particular man falls.
I think I really liked what you said about obsession and the very solipsistic quality of Humbert's mind. It is a mind in a strange way that mirrors Nabokov's in his obsession with butterflies and his obsession with chess. But having an obsessive streak, I mean, I fall down those rabbit holes all the time. Even I think around the same time that you're falling down Philip Roth's rabbit hole, I think it mirrors the I mean, Nabokov would love this. He loves mirror images and twinnings. I think I also had a similar phase. But anyway, he that obsessive streak is also a capacity that Nabokov seems to be able to step outside himself and observe. What I found, really interesting, which both of you guys, have said, have alluded to, is the mythology of Lolita versus Lolita, and how enduring the mythology continues to be. I still remember, I'm ashamed to say that I actually watched the movie.
Which movie?
The one where, like, I think that this was where, like, the cover was like of a young girl in a bikini with those sunglasses.
So Kubrick's, in other words, yeah.
And what I remember for a long time was those heart-shaped sunglasses and the bikini. For some reason, I thought the bikini, like, I was a young girl and I was like, I think that bikini is really hot. Like, where can I get one of those? And also many of the covers of the many editions of Lolita feature young women with juicy lips and with hourglass figures, and the endurance of the mythical Lolita really fascinates me, and I think it would have fascinated Nabokov because.
It definitely fascinated him, and I know this because when I was working on my book, I spent a lot of time at the Berg collection at the New York Public Library, where a lot of his papers are. They're sort of split between the NYPL and the Library of Congress. And whenever I'm doing archival research, the folders that I end up the most curious about are the ones marked miscellaneous. So I pulled one, and they were press clippings aplenty, not just about Lolita, but about kind of this weird cultural afterlife from newspapers all over the world. And I will never forget, it seared into my brain, seeing an image of Zsa Zsa Gabor in 1960 in a peignoir as Lolita for, I can't even remember which, it was some Italian magazine. And I just thought, what is going on here? This was before the movie, this was before Lolicon, this was before anything. It's almost like this misreading had been set so early after the 1958 U.S. publication in particular, that people, it's the cognitive dissonance element. It's that people were so wrapped up in whatever they actually thought they had read or heard about that they completely missed the fact that this book is kind of more like horror novel.
I mean, I think that's I think that's a point that I would love for us to kind of to stay with through our conversation tonight. I mean, to what extent is Lolita still being judged by those smutty book covers versus what lies inside those covers? And Julia, I mean, you write this, I think, very timely novel, also with the undeniable narrator, but also from the vantage point of a middle-aged woman who is questioning kind of her own body and her own desirability. What was it like to be writing that in? I think the book came out in 2022, right? This is in the age of Me Too, post Me Too. How did that affect your process of creating the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what the book came out of and what helped me, kind of keep writing it was really a profound. This is what I think I share very strongly with Nabokov is a very profound irritation, with what I felt like was an insistence on morality in art, or as portraying characters as people who needed to be looked up to or decried, either one, that we weren't just presenting, that if we put a situation out in front of people, it's said to be, I was saying to my editor today, there's a difference between writing about something and celebrating it. You can write about something. We can be inside of experiences. We can be inside of bad men's heads. I mean, I loved reading Philip Roth, and because I was like, oh my God, that's how someone thinks. I don't have to agree with how that person thinks. I was just so pleased to have the insight. I mean, isn't it just interesting to kind of get a different glimpse at the way somebody views the world, even if you don't agree with anything they say? So I feel like, and I mean, Nabokov he says this thing, he says it a million times, I don't want to touch hearts, I don't want to affect minds, I just want to produce the little sob in the spine, which is something that I feel like I relate to. I mean, of course you can't do that unless you want to touch truth, and I think he did want to touch an idea of truth, but he wasn't interested in like the novel is not as a banner of be this way or do this thing or think this way. He was interested in it as like laying bare something in front of our eyes and letting us come to it with all of our perception.
Yeah, I mean, I particularly loved kind of how you narrate desire and sort of that relationship between agency and constraint, especially when it comes to as liquid a concept as desire that feels so human and dangerous at the same time. Like it's something that is undeniably part of, every single one of us who lives and breathes, but also feels illicit and secretive and something to be stored away. I mean, how did you, I think it comes off so successfully on the page, but how did you navigate portraying something so dangerous on the page?
I mean, you just pretend that nobody's ever going to read it. For a while you're writing. I mean, I do think you have to kind of just try and access some sense of, what every writer really tries to do, which is to sit inside of something and say, potentially, this is how this character feels in this moment, and can I use the tools available to me, that is language, and see if I can, kind of make what I think is happening or feel is happening. Can I get as close to that as possible with the words I'm using?
Yeah, that, and I think that's, I think you pulled that off, marvelously. Well, it did make me think, Sarah, about kind of the experience of going back to do research, not directly kind of tied to this infamous, novel, but I was curious what the experience of researching as meticulously as you did, the tragically short life of Sally Horner, how did that change your reading of the novel, if it did at all? How did it change your relationship to the novel?
I mean, and I'm going to answer this a little bit elliptically just because I think it's important to talk about some of the post-reception that my book got, where a number of people, and I still get messages about this now, of they read it and, they act like they get upset and they're like, oh, I think Lolita's terrible, or, Nabokov, clearly there was something deeply wrong with him that he would even write such a novel. And I reject that because, like Julia, I think that fiction is not meant to be about a message. It's not meant to moralize. It's not meant to be prescriptive. It's meant to ask questions and engage readers in a way that makes them think. And I think that Lolita, because it's so woefully misread, that it kind of lays bare a lot of people's frankly, inability to think. And, you know, I don't mean that in a bad way, because you can take that supposed inability and then learn from it and maybe read other things that help you further along. With researching Sally's life, obviously, it would have been amazing if, say, she had kept a diary, or if there had been much more in her voice. I basically mined every scrap that I could of anything that she was reported to have said in newspapers, anything that at the time that I was able to reach out to them, her brother-in-law when he was still alive, her niece when she was still alive. And that was the thing too, is you're writing about a late 1940s, early 1950s story. And it really is a race against time to track people down before they die. Mm-hmm. And that's always a challenge. By the same token, in a way, researching Nabokov was difficult in a different way, because he's so elusive. And almost every time he would do interviews, he hated, say, a setup like this where he couldn't write things down and didn't want to be spontaneous. He couldn't do that. So he would always ask them to send the questions in advance, and he could write down the answers and essentially read them in, say, a television interview. Or I think the Paris Review interview is actually the perfect medium for him, because he needed to spend time thinking about what to say. And the corollary is maybe he had some canned answers. So it was always like peering through the cracks of all this and thinking, okay, through this incredible brick wall that he is throwing up, where do I find some approximate truth of what he was potentially thinking and feeling? And some of it was in the archives. A lot of it was moderated through his wife, Vera, who was basically, his true blue amanuensis, for good or for ill. And a lot of it was kind of trying to flip the script on anything that's absent, where if there was an outright denial that, say, Sally Horner was a potential inspiration for Lolita, which was discussed as early as 1963, then I could look at that denial and go, well, how is it phrased? And what's he really saying here? And why does he doth protest too much? Mm-hmm. So it was really just, peering through cracks and putting things together and arriving at linkages, even though it still doesn't take away from my overall feeling about Lolita as a novel, because I think I've now read it several times. I'm actually overdue to read it again properly. And I'll be curious what I think when I do that, because I think I'll take away something different than every time I have read it.
Well, it's really interesting to hear kind of about how about all the places that the research into both the book and Nabokov took you. I was amazed by how unexpectedly changed I was in my understanding of Lolita through reading your book, actually. And part of that has to do, and I am kind of in my stuffy way, not someone who looks too carefully at like the inspiration for literature. I always just think, well, if that literature can stand on its own, that's all that matters. And Sally Horner, I always knew that she didn't live a very long life. And I thought, like, if you're not, she, spoiler alert, but she dies at 15, in a car accident. So I thought, well, like, it's not like she has great kind of diaries for us to mine. But through your sensitive research, learning about the family background that she came from, the fact that she was being raised by a single mother from a working class background, and who couldn't take her on vacations, and who couldn't take her to nice places, and that was one of the excuses that was one of the reasons that made it so easy to kidnap Sally, because the Humbert figure, the real the kidnapper said, we're gonna say that you're going on a vacation, and it did make me think about how Lolita is a girl. I mean, I hesitate to even use the word Lolita because that's the name. Let's not forget that Humbert gives her. Dolores. These are young women who slip through the cracks because society has made it so easy for them to slip through the cracks. For single women to have a really hard time balancing motherhood and professional life, and through no fault of their own, their children become more vulnerable to predation because of that. And that really changed through reading about Sally Horner, thinking not so much about the delicious prose of Lolita, but about the larger, all too frequent phenomenon of how young women can be taken advantage of in such a variety of ways. And that made me think about Vladimir, the novel, how deeply and also sensitively you probe this notion of desire, not as something to be judged in black and white terms for either men or women, but that can be kidnapped by cultural, social condemnation of other people. And in that way, I think both your books so deepened kind of my continual kind of internal dialogue with Nabokov, with Lolita. And I wanted to, I know we're kind of running low on time here, but as I guess as we look ahead from 2025, one day Lolita will turn 100. Though I hope that I heard someone say that being a centenarian, being 100 is the new 80. And 80 is the new 60, so maybe it'll be a while before Lolita turns 100. But as we look ahead, what do we hope readers and writers continue to ask, kind of Lolita in the future decades? Are there questions you feel that have remain underexplored or deserve in some ways renewed attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, first of all, just kind of what we've talked about is like this fortress of alluring language which takes us away from the actual truth of the circumstances, which you have to look through to see. And I think that's kind of the beauty and the brilliance of the book is that Humbert is the ultimate charmer. He charms all of us into, for one moment, believing that what he's doing is not entirely sadistic, even as he tells us, as he's raping Lolita, that she's crying. Somehow, I think the great trick, and I think it's a sinister, but I think it's a necessary trick. Just because it's sinister doesn't mean it's not useful to be with or to examine. Is how. I mean, Nabokov is all language. I mean, in some ways, I feel like on the one hand, Sally Horner was a real person. On the other hand, he just used any excuse he could to create a structure.
Why, like the story of the ape is just as valid in Lolita's origin story as Sally, which I suppose also opens up questions about, can you really equate the story of an ape with the story of a girl and what that actually might mean?
Right.
But
the ape is Humbert.
Sure, but it doesn't take away from either.
Yeah, I think that's true. And then I think the thing I'm always interested in, and probably someone has done this, is actually looking at Lolita through the lens of like old Europe and its fascination with youthful America. Because I think the visiting to the motels, the national parks, but also the kind of story writ large on a metaphorical level feels like what is America giving? What is America tantalizing what are they? What is tantalizing about America to Europe, and what about Europe is tantalizing to America? And I think you can read the book through that lens. You have to, of course, there are people involved, but I think it's a really interesting way to think about attitudes of the two continents, especially at that particular time.
So one of the books that I relied on for research, which does get into that, I think was Robert Roper's, I want to call it Lolita in America. And it essentially talks about how the book is his American novel. And I was also thinking about it throughout this panel, but just now too, that I don't think you can divorce the writing and the publication of Lolita from Nabokov having been exiled in multiple countries, going from Russia, and then his father's assassinated, and then he's in Germany, and then he has to flee Germany, ends up in France, and then he and Vera and their son Dmitri are able to flee and get to America essentially before the Nazis could kill them, or whatever may or may not have happened. So America then becomes essentially, it's like this golden land concept that is so prevalent among emigres from many decades prior, and America is like promised land, it's opportunity. Certainly it was for Nabokov. And then, of course, once Lolita becomes a smash hit and he can retire from academia, then they move to Switzerland, and he ends up at this, glam hotel in Montreux and just, lives out his life. But I think at a time, too, when essentially the American experiment is under the greatest threat that it's ever been under in a very, very long time, maybe 150 odd years or whatever, then looking at Lolita through that lens of, well, if this was a novel that was supposed to exemplify America at its finest, the time when America was supposed to be great, what do we do now that so much is under threat, and how do we read that novel now?
Yeah, and I think just adding to that is he's just so profoundly anti-dogma. I think that's why he says, I don't want to touch hearts. I don't want to affect minds, because he's seen the risk and the damage of dogma in every country he's been in, until he's able to come to America and to some extent, live the life he wanted to live.
No, I think really well said. Both of you guys kind of arrived at the exact points that I hoped that we would reach by this point. I think being an immigrant, being someone who felt himself in lifelong exile, Lolita is also a book of terrible nostalgia. And I think that's what spoke to me most deeply as an immigrant. And of course, I'm not quite sure if I can return to China. I've done some political reporting, but I was going to say, even if I could, I would not be able to return to the China of my childhood. And I think, given the transformations of China, which is not unlike for Nabokov. I mean, he came from a family, that last generation of an opulent kind of, aristocracy, and that longing for the past is a kind of desire that can never be consummated. And I was talking to a friend last night about this panel, and I sort of blurted out, like, Nabokov never had, I think biographers have looked at his life extensively. He never had any interest in prepubescent girls. Like, I think none of that could ever be found.
There was no evidence. I certainly couldn't find any. And I think, if anything, he had a revulsion that he was trying to explore.
Absolutely. I think that was not the germ of inspiration, but that feeling of terrible longing for what cannot be captured. And you think about Annabel Lee. You think about The Kingdom by the Sea, and how Humbert when he's a young boy had a young girlfriend who, died, I think before she was out of her adolescence. And what it means for him that he wanted to go back almost in time, to travel back in time, even though it is grotesque for us to see that this is a middle-aged man wanting to consummate things with a 12-year-old girl. But you almost, inside the perverse head of Humbert, it is not unlike an immigrant wanting to go back, like for me, to the China of the 80s, where there was no market economy really, and that just is not. That's not something that I can ever return to, and I blurted out. What I blurted out was, it's like Nabokov wants to consummate time. That the sexual relationship is with time. He wants like that orgasmic gasp with time. And she was like, I think you should say that on your panel tomorrow. And I said, I wonder if I will offend pieties on stage.
Well, that definitely puts a new spin on time travel.
I think at this point, on that on that pious note, we would love to hear from you guys if you have any questions that you want to throw up. Yes.
First, thanks on being good insights. That's been great. And towards the end, first you mentioned your daughter, and then kind of what we were talking about at the end. It reminded me of the very first part, not Humbert narrating, but whoever the psychiatrist is, or
John Ray Jr., yeah.
Yes.
we're talking about this is a case study in how we should protect children in the future and always strive for that. I'm curious, through that lens, how you interpret the book and what that can be brought to today and things like that.
I mean, maybe it's because I was just thinking about that introductory note again, that another thing that we forget also about Lolita is that it's all pseudonyms. Her name isn't Dolores Hayes. His name isn't Humbert. So already we're off balance. Already we're in unreliable narrator territory. And already this can't be trusted. So just starting with that is just, it creates this feeling of vertigo from the get-go.
I mean, it's interesting because I guess I feel like I don't know if it's, I suppose he's unreliable, but he's not lying to us. He's just
lying to himself.
He's just lying to himself, He's not leading us down a different path. He's just himself deluded about what he's seeing, which makes it, it's just an interesting way to think about him. Yeah, but I mean, when you talk about what is happening and what is not happening, there's conversation after conversation that he has with strangers in the book where they basically say things to him, and it's unclear about whether he mishears them or if they're onto him. So we're in the grips of his paranoia the whole time, which I think is also just really fascinating. Yeah.
And then we haven't even talked about his, essentially fight to the death with Claire Quilty, who is also a very monstrous figure and is very open about his monstrosity in a way that horrifies Humbert. So to have that contrast, that almost to the point of kind of high comedy, is also a whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, on that point, connecting the question to kind of the points that you guys have made, I mean, that the John Ray Jr. note in the beginning really puzzled me as a younger reader when I was reading the novel for the first time, because it says, it says, everything, this should be, I think, this should be essentially a note of caution or lesson to our future kind of social workers, parents about the what can happen in these situations. And I thought it was such a kind of Nabokov had a lifelong hatred of Freud in a way that sometimes felt like he was protesting too much because
Oh,
he
like
would,
Dostoevsky? Like he was obsessed with hating Dostoevsky. It's like if you hate him so much, why have you read all of his work? What is going on here?
But with Freud, yes, I mean real contempt for Freud, and I think that note in the beginning about kind of this being a note of caution to future generations is also in a way Nabokov telling us that his novel, that this work of art he has made cannot be reduced simply to moral and psychological lessons. I mean, he hated Freud because he thought, okay, well, Freud, if everything can just be connected to our mommies and daddies, it's like, why do we even need literature? You know, everything can just be about wanting to, you know, sort of sleep with, you know, our moms and dads, like in in these distorted ways. And he was Nabokov was someone who hated simplicity, and he hated cliches. I mean, speaking of the quilty chase. I mean, the second half of the book turns almost, if you guys remember, into the parody of a crime novel, and there's something about I think of in my mind, I imagine Nabokov railing against these fornicating cliches. Like he's like, I will not let kind of the romance trope, the crime trope, I will not let you readers sit pretty with kind of assuming that you know how these books will end and kind of the convention of the form. I will, you know, parody them kind of better than kind of how any mid-list romance novelist or crime novelist can kind of produce, but I will also make you think past these cliches, and I that's why I think the John Ray Jr. Preface adds so much, because it's like from the jump he tells you, don't think you can reduce my novel to a moral lesson or to a psychological lesson, because I simply won't allow it.
Yeah. It's a joke, you know. It's when you read it, I mean, Nabokov is so funny. It's a funny joke at the beginning of the novel. I always wonder when he wrote it, if someone made him, I don't know, maybe you know, Sarah, if someone made him frame it in that way, if it came later, or if he thought, oh, this frame might be an interesting way to put on it. I mean, obviously the joke is that it's in no way a report, you know.
No, I think that was there, maybe not from the get-go, but it wasn't like a last-minute addition by any stretch.
No, I think that I'm so happy to have you, Sarah, the researcher, bear out these kind of like unfounded intuitions of mine, which is that it must have been there from the get-go, because it so in so many ways kind of is at the foundation of the novel, which is about preempting these the cliches that exist inside the reader's head. Like I'm producing something that's wholly original. I think originality was so important to Nabokov, something that you can't put neatly into one of your boxes. Anyway, yes.
Yeah, you alluded to how strange these times are now. One of the huge themes today is pedophilia, right? Interestingly, the people committing it are the ones accusing others.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, projection is a very
yeah.
common thing.
So this is, I think that's sort of an archetypal transgression of the male gaze toward young females and young males, actually. I don't know if there's a corresponding thing.
I was about to say, is there a question?
Yeah, but I was wondering if you thought that this was, that today there's some archetypal reckoning with this dynamic of, male gaze seeking transgressional union with youth.
Yeah, that's a difficult one to ponder. I do think that obviously they're, just between anything related to Jeffrey Epstein, Pizzagate, the many, many, many members of one particular party who seem to, it's like every day there's some elected official or related who, is arrested for child sexual assault material or something related. And I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that, except that
I have an attempt at one, which is that pedophilia, I mean, even I've heard in prisons is the one crime that is punished by fellow prisoners kind of most severely. And there's just this instinctual, like our moral gaze cannot look upon it without turning quite literally red. And then the hypocrisy that you mention of even those that practice it, they practice it with a kind of self-hatred. There is insight into just how revolting it is, and by association, how revolting they must be. And as you mentioned, its prevalence does speak to Nabokov's curiosity about the nature of desire, and also, I think, despite his contempt for Freud, I think Freud's insight into our relationship with our past, with our childhood, kind of where those longings might come from. And there's something so dangerous about not being able to, I think, have a conversation with ourselves about those desires, because there's something, the person who has those urges, many times I think there's also just kind of in their mind, it's that battle between kind of the condemnation that they recognize and this urge that they cannot help, that they will also not even many times seek help for because it feels so disgusting. And you sometimes, having, read, I think there was a New Yorker article about this, like how do you, it's about not being able to air that in public. That is the most damning, because if you cannot share it, then there's no way, there's no investigation of kind of how did that happen. And I think, it so insidiously wanders into the realm of politics because, with Pizzagate, it's like the surest way of attacking your enemy is by calling them a pedophile, no matter how little evidence exists for its truth.
I think in the case of Epstein, and even just not to like put it, it's not necessarily pedophilia, but Donald Trump's like they'll just let you. Like what feels like related to our current moment is a really insidious sense of nihilism, that I want something so I can take it, and it's okay because nobody cares what I do. All they want is money, power, or their issue, supported. We've kind of lost a thread of. It's a really nihilistic. Viewpoint to enact your power over a young woman.
That power
or a young boy.
Asymmetry, I think, is also what Nabokov shows to be the most damning in Lolita. Because if we were to imagine, the 13-year-old Humbert, even sleeping with his 13-year-old sweetheart. We might have our opinions about that, but that's two children. That's two adolescents exploring together. What's heinous is when a middle-aged man exerts that power over a 12-year-old. that power asymmetry, not the sex itself. I mean, as in 12-year-olds, I'm sure are having sex amongst themselves. But that the act itself is not. That's not the crime. It's the fact that a middle-aged power uses all his resources, everything that's available to him, to imprison a 12-year-old psychologically and physically. I mean, that's the real crime. Yes.
Thank you. I guess you've helped me understand it's no surprise that politicians would engage in these power relationships across the board. And I've heard another power relationship that this book might be an analogy for the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union that Nabokov lived under. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yes. I have an answer. Do you guys want to take a crack?
Yeah, I mean, he was born in 1899. It wasn't the Soviet Union yet, but he was a child of privilege, and his father was a noted journalist who ended up assassinated around, a few years after the Russian Revolution. So he was still there when Lenin took over. He was still there when Stalin took over. So he had direct experience of what it was like to live under regimes that, were, as you say, totalitarian and, accumulating power, accumulating land. And eventually it became clear that it was not sustainable, and he and his family had to leave.
He really hated the Bolsheviks, and this really resonated with me, I guess, as a product, at least early, of communist China. And I remember when I first also read not Lolita, just Nabokov in general, I was like, this ivory-towered, child of literal Russian royalty. What do I have in common with him? But his, and I think, Julia, you mentioned this, his hatred for dogmatism, for that kind of unthinking conformity, is also what made him an artist, I think, of the highest order. In one of his earlier novels, he says, curiosity is insubordination in its purest form. And that line has always stayed with me, coming out of a education system that where obedience was the highest was the highest virtue. And I think relating back to what we've discussed tonight about Lolita, the myth, versus the book, what's out, kind of what publishers might use to entice readers versus what lies inside the book. I think, Nabokov, who was a lifelong chess player and was very, very good at devising these chess games, these very complicated chess games. I think of Lolita as a chess game, as a chess problem of the highest difficulty, in that he is daring you, the reader, with the premise, I am going to write into the mind of a monstrous pedophile and murderer. Let's not forget, also murderer. And I dare you not to be charmed just a little bit by him. And I think about that chess game, that chess problem that he sets out for himself. And then I'm reminded of how, as also a chess obsessive, I'm a very obsessive person, so that's also something that draws me to Nabokov. As a chess obsessive myself, he said something that really resonated with me in one of his autobiographical essays, which is that chess is like a novel in that the real game is not between black and white. It's between the person who has devised the chess problem and the person who has to play to solve it. And I think in that way, Lolita is the most original, and to get back to your original question about Russia, and the most insubordinate way of daring the reader. And really, if you solve the chess problem, you see how monstrous Humbert is. And yet, you also cannot help but appreciate how seductive he is. But you are not seduced. Ultimately, you are not seduced because you see that he is playing at seduction, Humbert. And it's a chess problem. It's someone who has played many chess problems. It's one of the highest order.
I was wondering if you could speak to the character of Charlotte Hayes, because I feel like she always drops out of the discussion, but it's her existence and then her death is so key to what happens. And I think when I was younger, I was way more judgmental of her, that I was like, oh, she's weak. And then rereading it when I was older, I was like, that's actually not a complete understanding of this character.
That Hayes woman.
I mean, she is pretty bad, though. I think, in terms of, I don't think that she is, she's, she wants to send Lolita to boarding school. She wants to send her to summer camp. She can't wait to get her away from her. All she wants is to, put her daughter out of her mind and not have a daughter again. And I think that's, in a way, the setup that makes Lolita so vulnerable to Humbert. And also, of course, she's pitiable. She wants his love. He doesn't want to give it to her. But Lolita, I think it's more about building the case that Lolita was really an abandoned, neglected child who was going to be easy for Humbert to take advantage of because of her relationship with her mother. That's my take on Charlotte.
And yet, there are moments in the book in which we are in the mind of Humbert, and despicable Humbert, while he is in bed with Charlotte, is just trying to conjure up Lolita, and he's like, oh, I'm trying my hardest just to see a little glimmer of my beloved Lolita. But there's a very real sense in which were Lolita to grow up, into a mature woman, she would have become Charlotte, or a version of Charlotte. And I think that's, and in a society, I think maybe a little bit less so in 2025 than half a century or 70 years ago, that women are reliant on men in this catastrophic way. And yes,
look at Dolores herself, that, we're left where Humbert tracks her down and she's pregnant and married and still a teenager. And he's, whatever attraction he has felt is completely dissipated. And it's played as this very poignant scene. But you can also feel just this almost rising disgust that he has at her predicament. And it's not just because she might be Charlotte, it's that she isn't that fantasy ideal that he had in his head and exploited for so long. With respect to Charlotte, she makes some really bad decisions. And I think just because of, the research I did in my own book of trying to understand why certain women would end up making terrible decisions that would imperil their children. And it was a time when everything felt more desperate, and decisions that were terrible were maybe the least worst.
I don't want to judge her too harshly. She's not bad.
No. But I agree with you that she's not a great mother. And I think that's a moment for us to sort of see how, in the grown woman Charlotte, how infantilized her decisions are. a real mother, you would hope, is one who is whose first priority is protecting their child, not nursing their sort of almost adolescent sexual passions, right? So that's another moment of inversion, right? Where Lolita is out there on her own, and Charlotte Hayes, I mean, by virtue of still being mentally almost the age of Lolita, can only think about herself. She's not able to really inhabit the role of a mother. And what kind of society do we live in where women are, because of the many tools of independence that are taken from them, remain in so many ways infantilized? That's not to take, agency from women, in that there are women who are much less infantile than others. Not all mothers at that time would have been Charlotte Hayes. But again, this is not a society that set women up for success as nurturing mothers, as independent girls and women with the resources to both love and defend themselves.
Sorry, we might have to leave it there, but I hope you'll hang around for a little bit. We have some books for sale. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful discussion.
Thank you all.